On the icy morning of December 16, 1944, in the half-light before dawn, the forests of the Ardennes lay silent under a heavy lid of fog, their branches sagging beneath fresh snow that muffled the distant rumble of artillery. Inside a narrow, frozen valley near the town of Losheim, Major Ernst Weber, commander of an armored vanguard, stood atop the lead Panzer, listening to the muted growl of engines struggling to stay alive in the cold. The attack, so carefully prepared, so desperately hoped for, had begun with stunning speed. American outposts had been taken by surprise. Their thin defensive line was folding. For a moment it felt as if the impossible might happen. The German army, on the brink of collapse, had punched a hole straight through the Americans and was pouring westward. But even amid this sudden momentum, Weber sensed something off, something that didn't match the triumphant radio reports coming in from nearby columns. Through the dense fog, he could see crews clustering around stalled tanks, their breath rising in thin white clouds. He heard the coughing, choking sound of engines running on fumes. The loud crack of a starter motor echoed again and again as another Panther tried to come alive, failed, and then went silent. Soldiers were shouting, not in panic, but in frustration. The expected fuel trucks had not arrived. The promised reserves were nowhere along the forest track where they were supposed to be waiting. And for every tank that surged forward, two stayed behind, immobilized not by enemy fire, but by the absence of the one thing no battlefield courage could replace: gasoline. The irony was brutal. The offensive had been planned as a lightning thrust, fast, overwhelming, relentless. But Weber was watching lightning turn into a crawl. He moved among his men, asking quick questions, receiving the same answer each time. Half-filled tanks, nearly empty jerry cans, engines that were being kept warm only to avoid the risk of never restarting. The fog carried the heavy smell of exhaust, mixed with the sharper scent of burning oil. Somewhere to the west, muffled by snow, they could hear American artillery waking up, firing blindly toward the sound of engines. Yet the greatest threat pressing on them was not the enemy's guns, but the ticking clock of dwindling supplies. Weber climbed back onto his tank and scanned the white horizon. Technically, they were winning. Roads were open, the enemy was stunned, bridges were still intact. But as more and more machines sputtered into silence, the early feeling of triumph drained away. The offensive was not collapsing, but it was limping, and he knew well that hesitation on a battlefield was as deadly as defeat. If the tanks could not move, the infantry could not advance. If the advance slowed, the Americans would reinforce. And if they reinforced, the entire German plan, built on speed, would fracture. Snow kept falling, soft and indifferent. The engines that still ran echoed like distant, fading thunder. Weber felt the weight of a truth he could not yet fully name, a truth hinted at in every stalled vehicle around him. What looked like a breakthrough was already showing the first cracks of something far more dangerous. And as he listened to the silence between engine bursts, he sensed that these warning signs were only the beginning, because the deeper they pushed into the Ardennes, the more catastrophic the consequences of their invisible enemy would become. Hours after the first breakthrough, Major Ernst Weber found himself walking through the smoking remains of an American supply point seized during the morning rush. Snow had been churned into mud by tank treads and boots, mixing with spilled fuel and splintered crates. The air was thick with the scent of burned rubber and the faint sweetness of chocolate melting in the cold. Weber moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if he had entered not an enemy position, but another world entirely, a world whose scale and abundance were utterly foreign to the army he belonged to. His boots crushed cartons of canned meat, piles of brand-new winter jackets, and medical kits sealed just weeks before. It felt less like looting a battlefield depot and more like stumbling into the warehouse of a nation that had never heard the word shortage.
He kneeled beside a row of fuel containers stacked near what had once been a canvas tent. Bullet holes pocked the metal sides where retreating American guards had fired desperately before fleeing, but most cans were intact. Weber lifted one, wiped away the frost, and read the painted label. The fuel was fresh, shipped only days earlier, its origin marked from a refinery across an ocean. He opened it. The sharp, clean smell of high-grade gasoline rose into the icy air. For a moment, he just stared into the open can, realizing that this single container represented more than the fuel shortages tormenting his tanks. It represented a truth far larger and more devastating. The Americans were not merely well supplied. They were supplied with industrial force so vast, so organized, that even their forward depots looked like small factories. He walked deeper into the site, kicking aside scattered rations that German soldiers had already torn open. Everywhere he looked, he saw abundance. Boxes of boots in untouched stacks, rows of medical supplies wrapped in oilcloth, neatly folded blankets, ammunition arranged in labeled crates, and food packaged with mathematical precision. Weber opened a case of American field rations and froze. Each meal packet contained more calories, more vitamins, more variety than an entire day's ration issued to his own men. Even the chocolate bars had a manufacturing date from November, 3 weeks ago. "They fight with the present, and we fight with what remains," he murmured to himself. Nearby, a young German loader was trying to pull a heavy American winter coat over his shoulders, laughing incredulously at its warmth. Another soldier held up a pair of insulated boots as if they were relics. To Weber, the equipment felt unreal, too new, too plentiful, too perfect for the brutal winter ahead. He imagined the endless chain of ships, railroads, truck convoys, and depots that most lie behind this single forward point. Factories that never slept, refineries with no fuel rationing, warehouses filled not with scarcity, but with surplus. As he stepped back outside, the cold wind stung his face, carrying with it the distant drone of American aircraft, searching through the fog. The reality pressed into him with the weight of lead. Germany was not fighting an enemy of equal means. It was fighting a nation whose war machine was fed by a river of production so vast, so organized, that even their forward depots looked like small factories. And as Weber looked at the long line of his own tanks idling far below the ridge, waiting for fuel that still had not arrived, he felt an unease rising in his chest, a sense that this depot, overflowing with everything his army lacked, was not just a symbol of American strength, but a preview of something far more ominous waiting deeper in the Ardennes.
By the afternoon of December 17th, Major Ernst Weber rode at the head of a battered but still advancing armored column, its momentum slowing with every kilometer they pushed west. Snow drifted across the narrow roads, hiding patches of ice that made the tanks groan and slide, while soldiers marched beside them in heavy silence, conserving strength and breath. According to intelligence briefings, whispered with optimistic certainty, a massive American fuel depot waited in the small town ahead, large enough, they had been told, to refuel an entire Panzer division. It was the promise that had sustained Weber and his men through a night of creeping uncertainty. One good capture, one stroke of luck, and the offensive could regain its heartbeat. They reached the outskirts at dusk. The town lay quiet under the snow, its houses dark, its streets empty except for the fresh tracks of American vehicles that had fled only hours earlier. Weber ordered a search. His men spread out, lifting tarps, kicking open doors, scanning barns, garages, workshops, every place where hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel could be hidden. But as the minutes turned to an hour, frustration rose. They found burned trucks, scattered tools, and abandoned American rations, but no fuel tanks, no barrels, no storage units, nothing remotely close to what command had promised. Weber walked through the central square, his breath clouding in the frigid twilight as the unsettling truth began to settle in. Either the intelligence was wrong, or the depot was here and invisible. He stopped at what looked like a civilian lumber yard. Long rows of wooden crates stacked under snow.
For a moment, he considered ordering them opened, but they were obviously construction materials, firewood, timber, nothing that looked like fuel. And yet, a strange detail nagged at him. The crates were arranged in broad, flat rectangles rather than in usual tall stacks. Their layout formed massive, low silhouettes across the yard, almost like platforms. He dismissed the thought and moved on, unaware that he had just walked past what could have turned the offensive. Only months later, combing through captured American documents, would he understand that the Allies often stored gasoline in wide, horizontal stacks of sealed 5-gallon cans, disguised to blend with industrial equipment, a method he had never imagined possible. For now, the consequences were immediate and brutal. The deeper Weber moved into the town, the more he felt the offensive's pulse weakening. Tanks sat idle, with crews standing beside them, stamping their feet against the cold. Engines sputtered like dying animals. Supply truck officers argued about the last drips of fuel they had siphoned from abandoned American jeeps. Men knelt in the snow, shaking their heads as they opened empty barns where, according to their maps, fuel should have been waiting in abundance. The frustration became a kind of quiet panic, the kind that soldiers try to hide beneath discipline but cannot silence. When the last building had been searched and nothing had been found, Weber stood alone beside his immobilized Panther, the sky above turning from gray to pitch black. Snowflakes drifted in slow spirals around him, catching the dim orange glow of a burning farmhouse in the distance. The silence pressed in, broken only by the low murmur of soldiers asking the same question in different words. How do we advance without fuel? For the first time, Weber allowed himself to imagine the possibility that their greatest obstacle was not the enemy, but a logistical reality no one had dared to face. Then, from the western road, a scout patrol stumbled back into town breathless, their faces pale despite the cold. They reported seeing something strange. Rows upon rows of American fuel cans stretching into the darkness, arranged in shapes that looked nothing like a depot. And as Weber listened to their confused, shaken voices, he realized with a sinking dread that the greatest fuel source they had ever needed might have been sitting in plain sight the entire time, hidden only by the blindness of expectation.
By December 19th, the euphoria of the early breakthrough had dissolved into a grinding struggle for survival. Major Ernst Weber marched alongside his immobilized armored column, feeling the bitter wind cut through his uniform despite the American winter coat he had taken from the captured depot. The landscape around him looked less like a battlefield and more like a frozen graveyard of steel. One tank after another sat silent on the roadside, their engines dead, their fuel tanks bone dry. Snow had piled around the treads, forming white coffins for machines that only days earlier had carried the momentum of a desperate offensive. The men moved among them like ghosts, tired, hollow-eyed, carrying rifles that had almost no ammunition left. Their breath came out in ragged, frost-bitten clouds, each step sinking into a layer of ice that snapped beneath their boots. The wounded lay inside abandoned houses turned into makeshift aid stations. Weber entered one of them, a small, frozen cottage with shattered windows stuffed with blankets. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and the acrid chemical bite of improvised disinfectants. A young medic knelt beside a soldier whose leg was wrapped in strips of fabric cut from an American uniform jacket. Their medical kits had been exhausted long before, and now the wounded were treated with whatever could be scavenged: torn sheets, boiled snow water, morphine found in American pouches, sewing needles heated over candles to close gaping wounds. Weber watched a soldier bite down on a wooden spoon while another man tied a tourniquet around his thigh. There were no screams left in them, only low, exhausted groans that blended with the wind slipping through the ruined doorframe. Outside, soldiers crowded around small fires
fed with splintered furniture and broken rafters. They ate American rations, cold beans, meat, crackers, torn open with shaking hands, the food disappearing as fast as it could be found. German supply lines had collapsed to such a degree that their entire sustenance now depended on capturing American goods. Men wore mismatched coats, wool gloves too large for their hands, helmets taken from abandoned foxholes. A few had even strapped American boots to their feet, grateful for the warmth even if the sizes were wrong. To Weber, the sight cut deeper than any artillery wound. His soldiers were not an army anymore. They were scavengers moving through the Ardennes on willpower alone. At dusk, he climbed a ridge overlooking the road they had come from. The valley below should have been alive with engines and headlights, but instead it lay deathly still. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant crack of American artillery searching blindly in the fog. Weber's tanks, his pride, his bloodline, sat dark and lifeless. Officers argued quietly near one Panther, holding a map whose notes no longer mattered. Without fuel, the strategic objective ahead was irrelevant. The entire offensive, once envisioned as a thunderbolt strike toward the Meuse, now felt like a slow, doomed march into a tightening trap. Snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. Weber brushed flakes from his shoulders as if brushing away illusions. He knew now that no amount of tactical brilliance could revive what logistics had already strangled. His men were cold, underfed, exhausted, and armed with fewer bullets each day. Yet they pushed forward anyway, as if hoping that stubbornness alone could bend the laws of war. But Weber felt a truth growing inside him like ice. This was not an army advancing. This was an army dissolving in real time. Then, as the snowfall thickened, a rider arrived from divisional headquarters, stumbling off his motorcycle with a face gray from exhaustion. He handed Weber a message, marked urgent. Weber tore it open under the beam of a dim lantern, and the moment he read the first line, a heavy chill swept through him, deeper than the winter cold itself.
The message Major Ernst Weber received that night was brief, but its meaning struck harder than any artillery barrage. Supply command has collapsed. Expect no reinforcements, no fuel convoys, no ammunition columns. For Weber, the words were not a surprise. They were a confirmation. The disaster he had felt forming in the silent forests was now official, undeniable, and complete. The Ardennes Offensive, which had begun with the fire of ambition, was now sinking into the cold mud of reality. Days later, when the surviving remnants of the offensive staggered back across the German border, the men too exhausted to speak, the true scale of the collapse began to surface through the testimonies of the generals who had built the plan. And Weber, still carrying the weight of every stalled tank he had watched freeze into stillness, listened with a hollow, analytical calm. In a dim interrogation room, months after the offensive, high-ranking German officers sat across from their Allied counterparts, some defiant, others resigned, all carrying the knowledge of a catastrophe they had helped set in motion. The windows were covered, the air stale, the furniture plain. On the table lay documents outlining fuel shortages, production failures, and desperate requisitions that had never been fulfilled. General Alfred Jodl, face gaunt and pale, explained with a mechanical tone how German logistics had been unraveling for years. Trucks had been cannibalized for parts. Horses, more than 500,000 of them, had been reintroduced into the army because Germany no longer had the fuel to keep a fully motorized force alive. Factory output had shrunk under Allied bombing to a shadow of its former self. Other officers admitted the truth more bluntly. There had never been enough fuel for a sustained armored offensive, not even for the first week. The numbers had been massaged, the reports softened, the warnings dismissed. The plan required tens of millions of liters of gasoline, They had begun the operation with barely a fraction of that. Even the weather, once believed to be an ally, hiding German movements from American aircraft, was now revealed as a logistical nightmare, freezing engines solid and doubling fuel consumption. Weber listened as the confessions mounted. Ammunition factories unable to meet demand, railroads crippled by constant air attacks, roads so damaged that horse-drawn carts moved faster than supply trucks. The generals spoke not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted honesty, as if relief came from finally acknowledging what everyone at the front had already known. It became clear that the bravery of soldiers, Weber's men who marched hungry and sleepless through the frozen woods, had never been the issue. Courage had been abundant. Discipline had held where supplies had not. The enemy had not broken their spirit. Logistics had broken their bodies. One American interrogator summarized it with clinical precision. "You did not lose the battle, you ran out of means to fight it." The words echoed through the room like a verdict. Weber, sitting among the officers as an observer, felt the truth settle over him with the weight of inevitability. Courage could seize a town, hold a road, even repel a counterattack, but courage could not create fuel where none existed, nor summon ammunition from empty depots. It could not move a tank that had frozen into a monument of defeat. When the questioning ended and the officers were escorted away, Weber lingered in the room, staring at the scattered papers that documented the unraveling of a great military machine. Outside, the evening wind rattled the windows. The war was ending, but the understanding of its failures was only beginning. And as Weber stepped into the dim hallway, he sensed that the final revelation, one that would redefine how the world saw the Battle of the Ardennes, was still waiting in the shadows ahead.
In the final months of the war, long after the smoke of the Ardennes had thinned and the snow had melted from the Belgian forests, Major Ernst Weber stood on the edge of a ruined rail yard near Koblenz, now under Allied control. Train tracks twisted upward like broken ribs, freight cars lay overturned and charred, and the wind carried the distant hum of American trucks rolling in ceaseless columns toward the front. For the first time, Weber saw the full machinery of his enemy, not as scattered depots or captured supplies, but as a single, unified force, an industrial organism that never tired, never paused, and never failed to replenish itself. Watching the endless flow of equipment, he understood that the Battle of the Ardennes had never been a clash of courage, nor of tactical brilliance, nor even of battlefield positioning. It had been a confrontation between two national lifebloods, and Germany's had long since run dry. He traced the path backward in his mind, the idle tanks buried in snowdrifts, the frozen engines, the wounded treated with improvised tools, the soldiers wearing American boots and eating American rations because no German equivalents remained. And then he traced the American side. Ships crossing the Atlantic without pause, trains roaring across newly built supply lines, convoys stretching from the Channel ports to the front, every mile supplied with gasoline, ammunition, spare parts, clothing, machinery, food, medicine, and every conceivable material of war. Weber realized he had never truly understood what it meant for a nation to fight with factories, as he had once muttered in the ruins of a captured depot. Only now, witnessing the coordinated power of Allied logistics at full scale, did he comprehend the fatal imbalance. Germany was trying to win a war with scraps, with remnants, with hope stitched together by improvisation. America was fighting the same war with an industrial engine that filled the horizon. In quiet moments, he replayed scenes from the offensive, crews siphoning the last liters of fuel from abandoned vehicles, officers arguing over ammunition, the crushing silence of tanks that would never move again. None of those scenes had been the result of tactical error, They had been the logical, inevitable outcome of a system that had been collapsing for years. Even the boldest strategy had been built on foundations that were already crumbling. The Ardennes Offensive had not failed because its soldiers lacked bravery. It had failed because bravery could not ignite an engine, could not move a column, could not replace the millions of tons of material that Germany no longer possessed. As winter turned to spring, and the war finally ground to its end, Weber carried with him a sober understanding that history would later echo. The decisive weapon of the modern battlefield was not the tank, nor the rifle, nor even the soldier. It was the industrial might that kept them all alive. And when he looked once more at the American convoys crawling toward the Rhine like an iron river, he saw the truth with stark clarity. The Ardennes, he realized, had not been lost in the forests of Belgium. They had been lost in the factories, shipyards, railways, and supply depots that Germany no longer had, long before the first shot was ever fired.